show. Ian McGilchrist, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Alex. Delighted to be here.
Why is the brain separated into two physical hemispheres?
It's a basic and very good and important question. It's not really discussed very much, but we know that all the brains that we've ever looked at are divided in this way, so it's not a human thing only. And there are three important oddities. One is that it's divided at all, since the power of the brain is to do with making connections. Secondly, that it's asymmetrical, which is very odd because there's no reason for it to be asymmetrical. If you just needed more space, you could just produce more space symmetrically, you'd think. And the third is that there is a band of fibers at the base of the brain. But first of all, this is a new thing. It only started in mammals. Amphibians, reptiles, frogs have brains. Birds have brains that don't have even this body of fibers called the corpus callosum. And what's more, a lot of the import of the traffic across the corpus callosum in humans is inhibitory. So its final effect is to suppress a contralateral homologue. In other words, a bit of the other hemisphere that would be its partner, if you like. So these were questions that I thought were interesting and were in part a reason why I started to go into this area. And I suppose the first thing I have to say is that most people who don't know about the recent developments, and particularly about my work on hemispheres, think that they've heard it long ago was exploded. It was a myth, a popular piece of psychology that had no basis in fact. And this is sort of slightly right and mainly very, very wrong. The slight bit of right is that the questions were good. Why are the hemispheres separated? How are they different? It's just that we didn't get the right answers at the time. And when people start asking questions in science, they didn't expect to find the right answers immediately. They expect to have to do further thought, further gathering of data, and to be able to come up with something that actually does fit the realities. And the answer is, if you like, to cut to the chase, that all creatures, in order to survive, have to do a remarkable feat, which is to pay attention to something that they need to get, and at the same time look out so that they're not themselves got. And for this, you need two types of attention. And these types of attention are so different that they require neuronal masses, each of which can sustain conscious attention independently. One of them is going to pay very targeted attention, very narrow beam attention to something that it wants to get, that it knows is important, usually food, or eventually something like a twig to build a nest, or in apes to get something to use as a tool. And that is the left hemisphere's attention, narrow, fragmentary, piecemeal attention. But at the same time, the brain has to be able to look out for predators, but also for kin, for your mate, your offspring, and so on, so that while you're busy in surviving by getting stuff to eat, you're also looking out for the whole picture. And that is evolved in the right hemisphere. And so effectively, the right hemisphere is looking out for everything else, for the big picture of the world, while the left hemisphere is concentrating on a detail that it already knows it wants. And this has important consequences because the way we attend to things changes what it is we find there, changes what comes to our attention. And in summary, what we find is that the two halves of the brain sustain two different versions of reality. It used to be said that one did reason and language and the other did pictures and emotions and so on, but all that is wrong. We know that both hemispheres are involved in everything. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. That doesn't mean we've met a dead end. It's that we were asking the question in a slightly wrong way, which was, what do they do, these hemispheres, as though they were machines? This is the question you ask of a machine. But in fact, they're part of a person. And there's important question to ask about anything to do with living beings and human beings is how, in what way, with what reason, with what purpose are we doing what we're doing? Why are we attending, and in what way are we attending? And so in the left hemisphere, there is built up a phenomenological world which is composed of discrete fragmentary pieces that are decontextualized, static, so that they can be easily frozen and picked up rapidly, and effectively inanimate. And everything that it understands is clear, explicit, cut and dry. It's a seed, it's a rabbit, it's whatever, it's my lunch, I need to get it. Whereas the right hemisphere is very much more subtle. It's looking out for everything else. It sees that nothing is ever ultimately completely devoid of connections with everything, really, everything else. That things are always in motion. They're never actually finally static. But they're also never wholly certain. That they may carry a certain degree of conviction, but they're not black and white and cut and dried in the way the left hemisphere makes them. The left hemisphere really understands what's explicit, and the right hemisphere understands what is implicit. And that's a very big thing, because all the things that really matter to us most need, in a way, to remain implicit, because they're reduced by the process of bringing them into prosaic everyday language. And effectively, this is an animate world. So those are the two different worlds. And you could put it this way: the left hemisphere creates a map, a diagram, a theoretical structure of the world, which is very thin, very sparse, very jejune, devoid of complexity, devoid of really anything that makes the thing live. But it has the schema. And the right hemisphere, meanwhile, is seeing the whole complex picture in all its ramifications and its beauty. And it's that in other words, it's the world that the left hemisphere is mapping. So that's a good enough place to start, really.
Okay.
A map in the left brain, and in the right brain, the thing that is mapped.
The world that is mapped.
The world that is mapped. So we've essentially got here two brains. And the thing that I find fascinating, reading The Master and His Emissary, which is an extraordinary volume. I sort of only got a little bit into it, and was already thinking this is kind of blowing my mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Or my minds, I suppose I should say. One thing that got my attention is that this isn't something that people might think that, well, there are sort of two brains right now that are doing different tasks, super specialized, but if we evolve further, they'll probably sort of merge into one big brain. It seems like evolution is selecting for this asymmetrical brain separation. And as you've already said, the corpus callosum, or callosum, that connects the two, does more to inhibit communication between them than it does to facilitate it. I mean, that's an extraordinary finding, that the connector between the two parts of our brain is purposefully trying to stop them from communicating, and that this is something that is evolutionarily selected for. I thought that was absolutely incredible. And I suppose what you're suggesting here is that the reason for this is because, what if they were to communicate too much, then maybe one would get in the way of the other?
Yes, there needs to be a necessary balance between separation and togetherness, if you like. Funnily enough, nature in general works with competition and cooperation. One of the myths that really needs to be revised is the idea that evolution is all about competition, and that we are somehow competitive apes. There's no doubt that competition plays a very important role in evolution, but actually those species that have really thrived have been those that have learned to cooperate and collaborate. So in fact, the situation is the same in the brain. Everywhere in nature there is, and this was an insight that Goethe had in the 18th century, that in nature all that is unified is being divided, and what is divided is being unified. I think that it doesn't perhaps sound very important, but it is actually a crucial insight. And hence that the hemispheres need to work together, but part of the way of working together is not to get in one another's way and try to compete to do the same task. I sometimes say, in order to carry out a successful operation, there needs to be a surgeon and there needs to be a scrub nurse. as a minimum. And without the scrub nurse, the operation would be extremely difficult. Without the surgeon, impossible. But it doesn't make sense for the scrub nurse to make the incision. The scrub nurse needs to do the job of the scrub nurse, and the surgeon needs to do the job of the surgeon. So that's the way it is. What I would say is you're completely right to say that the tendency of evolution is not towards homogenization, but towards preserving this distinction. And I just want to comment on your remark, which I know was in a way just a relatively off the cuff one about two minds. I think that the reality is that our mind is at least our conscious mind is not aware of this division. Our unconscious mind is at some level bringing this information from the two hemispheres together in a way that we should not be aware of. If we were aware of it, it would hinder us. So nature has taken care that all this is done at a level which is probably in the midbrain, which is the head of the brain stem.
I mean, yeah, inevitably when you learn about this distinction between the different hemispheres, especially when you learn that like the left hemisphere governs the right eye and the right hemisphere governs the left eye, you inevitably sort of start closing an eye, looking around the world and seeing if maybe am I seeing things a bit differently? Am I noticing, narratives more and objects more in this eye? I'm not really sure. And obviously it's a bit ridiculous because that's not how it works. But that just speaks to the fact that yes, this is something that is not a conscious phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't want to be annoying and trip in, but I have to say that actually it doesn't work like that in humans. So in humans, the left visual field of both the left and right eye goes to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field of both the left and right eye goes to the left hemisphere. In many animals, they have eyes on the sides of their head, and there is literally just a straight crossover. But because humans have eyes on the front of their head, partly because we evolved from apes that needed to be able to judge distances of branches ahead, they needed to be able to do this, bifocal way of seeing things, and so it's not quite true. It is true that the right ear feeds pretty much to the left hemisphere and the left ear to the right.
That's probably why it wasn't really working for me when I was switching back and forth. Has that got something to do with the fact that the ears are literally on the side of the skull in a way that in many birds, for example, the eyes are on the side of the skull? It's like the position of the organ that changes its relation to the brain?
It does, yes.
And I was wondering if you could tell us, I mean, you list a few in the book. I'm not sure how many you could think of off the top of your head, but examples of, so in birds, for example, with their eyes on opposite sides of their head and governed by different hemispheres, seemingly being able to perceive the world differently through different eyes. So, for example, if I'm not mistaken, at least some birds will be better at spotting predators with one eye rather than the other, and you hypothesize that this is because of the fact that they're seeing the predator in an eye that is more apt to looking out for predators, right?
Yes, well, you can actually see birds turning their head in a way which would be abnormal for the situation. If there's a predator that's in the wrong visual field, they will turn so that it's in the visual field, the left visual field, that comes to the right eye, because the right eye, the right brain is, sorry, the left eye to get to the right brain. The right hemisphere is the hemisphere which is looking out for the predator. And experiments have been done in lizards in which one eye was experimentally taped over and a predator was produced. And obviously when it's the right eye that's been taped over, which feeds to the left hemisphere, they look through the untaped eye. But when it's the left eye that has been taped over, which is the eye through which they would normally inspect a predator, they turn their heads to try and look through the taped over eye. They try to look through it because that is their habit. So I just say that because it illustrates very clearly that there are these differences. They're not 100% differences. Nothing in biology ever is, but there's a statistically highly significant difference between the use in a bird of its left and its right eye.
We'll get back to Ian McGilchrist in just a second, but first, trust in our news media is at an all-time low, and people often make up their minds about media. For example, reporting is coming from, they're emphasizing sorted news than to get said is do, and I know it's quite tricky to. So you've given a sort of sketch of what the different hemispheres do, and I know it's quite tricky to pin it down exactly. And like you say, they're both involved in everything. But if you had to sum up, you say that it used to be the case that people would think left brain is like, I don't know, reason, rationality, language maybe, and the right brain is like art, music, poetry, and that's misleading. It seems like you're saying. Could you give us maybe 3 better words on each side of the brain to try to approximate what it is that these hemispheres are responsible for?
Well, I think the point is, if I was to answer your question outright, one pairing would be the left hemisphere is, in a way, only aware or only interested in what can be made unambiguous and explicit, whereas the right hemisphere is capable of sustaining things that are on the surface of them perhaps opposites, but that coexist and need one another and are perhaps at the same time in different ways present in the situation. It's also much better at understanding the implicit. So there was some truth in what you just said. But let me try and separate it out. So, as I said, the difficulty with the way we used to think was that it was about what they were doing, so reason, language, pictures, emotions. But in each of those cases, I can very clearly explain that, for example, language, some of it is very much a part of the left hemisphere. And what is very, very largely true is that speech, the articulation of speech is in almost everybody in the left hemisphere. But that's not the whole of language. And the most important part of understanding language actually is supplied by the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is a little bit like a computer that's been given the Oxford English Dictionary and a book of rules of syntax, and is trying to decode the message. Whereas the right hemisphere sees that the meaning of this is something that is not being stated, that is quite different. A very, very simple everyday example is if you're speaking in an auditorium and you say, it's very hot in here, and the left hemisphere is saying, he's pointing out that on a hot day in a room with a lot of people, it's getting warm. No prizes for that. But the right hemisphere understands what he's really saying is, could you switch on the air conditioning or open a window? So the implicit meaning is what the right hemisphere understands, only the explicit, the left hemisphere. Now, when you think about it, so much of what is truly important in language, even in everyday language, is metaphorical in nature, sometimes ironic, oblique. It may be as important what is not being said as what is being said. Poetry, in fact, is something the right hemisphere is much better at than the left. And that's because its linguistic capabilities are different from those of the left. The left are to do with narrowing down on the certainty. In fact, if you wanted to make another difference between the left and right that is global, the left hemisphere's whole raison d'etre, if you like, is to try to narrow down to a certainty, whereas the raison d'etre of the right hemisphere is to open up to a possibility. So it's always saying yes, but it might not be that. Ramachandran calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate, because it's seeing other possibilities here. So that's true of language. It's true of reason too. So some kinds of reasoning are better done by the left hemisphere. But when you get beyond the carrying out of rote procedures, often the right hemisphere is better able to understand the meaning of a calculation. So the left hemisphere is better at times tables, partly because they're all recited and ingested in that way in childhood. And it follows rules and procedures. It's very good at that. It is, in fact, a bureaucrat. it was appointed as the emissary, the one that would go about and be a high-functioning bureaucrat for the master. The master's the one that sees the whole picture. So this is true of reason and language just as much as anything else. And to come to emotions, the most lateralized of all emotions is anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is not a cool customer. It is not without emotions. It tends to have more self-centered, self-righteous emotions and more social emotions, but the deeper ones like empathy and melancholy and so on are more appreciated by the right hemisphere, and so on. I could go on, but what I'm really pointing out is it's the mode in which you're thinking about whatever it is will tell you which hemisphere is more important, not the actual sphere of activity, of human activity.
Yeah. What I'm interested in, I suppose, is what this means for us, because we've got these two different hemispheres sort of governing different ways of being in the world. Like you say, it's not so much a different way of thinking about the world, but different ways of being in the world. It's just a different way to react. I mean, you often see people have discussions with each other, and it feels like they just don't understand where each other are coming from. And the terminology of saying one is being too left brain and one is being too right brain can be very helpful there. It's kind of like if you see Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins have a conversation about God and religion, and Peterson is talking about sort of narrative and how things are truer than true, and that, it's kind of fiction, but it's a special kind of fiction. And then Richard Dawkins being like, I want to know if you put a camera in, if you put a camera in front of the tomb, would you see a man walk out of it? Like, did it literally happen? And it's extraordinary. I mean, it seems more understandable to me that Richard Dawkins is baffled by Jordan Peterson being asked, did the Exodus story happen? And Peterson responds, it's still happening. That's his response, quite baffling. But it seems equally baffling to Jordan Peterson when somebody asks him, do you think it actually happened? Like, do you think that a man rose from the dead? Do you think that Jesus was born of a virgin? And he's like, I don't even know how to begin answering that question. I don't have the requisite understanding of the terms that you're using. That seems absolutely baffling. Do you think that is a sort of a conflict like that, something like a battle between left brain thinking and right brain thinking?
Well, I rather resist these rather simple ways of using the terms, but I can't entirely disagree with you. I think that ultimately, when you start unpacking the way in which the right and the left hemisphere see the world, you can see that there are such differences. I mean, in many ways, Richard Dawkins is a scientific reductionist. He's a reductionist materialist. I hope I'm not doing him an injustice in saying that. But I think he therefore misunderstands the meaning of many things. And one of them is that when it comes to certain things like, for example, consciousness, the ability to grasp it, to pin it down, to say what it is and where it arises, this is almost the wrong way to approach it, because it's not a thing like that. It's not another thing in the world alongside the things that consciousness allows us to be aware of. And God is not a thing in the world in the way that a rock or a stone or a tree is a thing in the world, or at least I would begin to want to qualify that as well. But for these purposes, let's say a bicycle is a thing in the world. But God is not a very complicated machine. He's not a very complicated anything of the kind that we know. And so to try to approach God in that way is going to produce no insight into what people mean. And you have to be either a very arrogant or a very confident person to say, well, all these people who think that they understand something that I can't see, they're just wrong because I can't see it. Another way of looking at it would be, well, maybe I need to revise my thoughts about what is true. And I know this sounds like sort of hedging one's bets. But is there a truth that can be stated in words that is true to what human nature is? So is human nature, in other words, something that can be written down in a scientific text, and that pins down and exhausts what a human being is? Now, human beings we know exist, and we all have experience of them. But in order to convey the realities of what a human being is, encounters, and is capable of, you'd have to turn to art. You'd have to turn to the works of Shakespeare. You'd have to turn to narratives. You'd turn to stories, to great myths which explain our relationship to a divine realm or to the cosmos or to one another.
What the fuck?
And if you don't have, and I think some people are just born without the capacity to feel what it is that art tells us, what poetry tells us, what music tells us, what rituals tell us, what narratives tell us, then you won't understand why you're missing a very great deal, because you're trying to make it all fit into a very, onto a Procrustean bed. You're trying to cut off everything that doesn't fit into this one way of looking at things. And to make this clear, in the ancient world, in the ancient Greek world, and these people were by no means fools, or I mean, they were the first scientists in the modern sense, so Dawkins should hold them in great respect. And they did make extraordinary scientific advances, but they didn't think that these advances would tell them the answers to the big questions like, what is a human being? What is it? What does consciousness mean? Where is it? Who has it? What is the divine? What do we mean when we talk about the sacred, which almost everybody experiences and finds a need to talk about the sacred, even if they don't use the term God. It doesn't really matter. And so in this ancient Greek world, there were two conceptions of truth: mythos, or muthos as it would be originally, and logos. And mythos has given us the word myth, and logos has given us the word logic. But they believe that the big truths, the really deep truths, the great truths, could only be encompassed by poetry, by narrative, by what falls in the realm of myth. And that logic was the sort of thing that a lawyer would do in a courtroom to settle a dispute and decide how much money was owed by one person to another. So it operated on a much more trivial realm. Now you can say, I'm only interested in that trivial realm in which things can be measured and demonstrated by a photograph and so forth. But do you believe in love? Do you think that love is real? If you don't think it's real, I pity you, because it's the most staggering experience in life, and it has many forms. And there's the love one has, erotic love for a partner. There is the love one has for nature. There is for those of us who sense something greater and divine. There is the love one has for that. But love cannot be demonstrated in a laboratory. It cannot be manipulated. It can't be measured in any way. Does that make it unreal? Not at all. So I feel there's just a huge discrepancy between a very narrow idea of what truth is and a broader one. And if you'll permit me, I just want to say something about truth there. That there are many ways, of course, of thinking about what truth is, and many types of theory and philosophy about how to think of truth. But two that are very important because they're quite different and we can recognize them are truth as correctness, which is really this closing down on a precise form of words or measurement that encompasses what it is that we are looking at. There's something out there which is the truth, and I'm going to take steps which lead me in a linear fashion towards that truth, and I get closer and closer to that truth, which is an entity somewhere. And the other is that truth is a process of discovery, of unveiling. And when I say discovery, I mean literally uncovering the accretions that have come between us and a deeper truth that is not discernible by the everyday eye of reason. The everyday eye of reason is very valuable. I very much respect reason and science, and they've served me well for many, many years. And you know, I worry that nowadays, in fact, both of them are coming under attack. People are discrediting science unless it fits with the narrative of what they would like politically to think is true. People are discarding reason if they don't find that it leads to the place they want to go. And I'm not attacking them. I'm just saying they have limitations. Intuition has limitations too, but it also has great powers to put us in touch with things that science alone won't take us to. And indeed, much of science was actually solved not by the scientific method, but by a process of intuitive approach towards a gestalt, a shape, a form, which gave the answer to a mathematician or to a scientist. And imagination is also a very important tool. And it seems to me that what Dawkins is saying, I don't say he has no imagination, I don't know him that well, but he wants to say that what imagination reveals to him is not true. But that's because he's got an idea, I suspect, that imagination is something that takes you away from reality. It's what I would call fantasy. Whereas, as was known to the great philosophers of the late 18th and early 19th century, imagination was the way in which one felt one's way into the true reality of something other than oneself. And without imagination, one couldn't reach it.
So where have we gone wrong here then? Because the kind of Dawkins-esque approach of the primacy of, I suppose, in a way, left brain thinking, seems to be dominant, and I think you've said in the past and recently that the world is sort of becoming a bit left brain dominant, or is a bit left brain dominant in a way that maybe it once didn't sort of used to be. And I'm interested for two reasons. The first is sort of like, you know, when I say how does that happen, I don't just mean what are the social conditions that make people think this way, but I mean, how is it that the brain starts acting differently? Is it like this mind that connects the two hemispheres just sort of starts ignoring one side? Are we able to train the mind into sort of residing more in the right brain or the left brain? That seems very strange. If you have one brain that is all connected and communicating with each other, how can it even be the case?
I mean, you're thinking in terms of an alternative, this is on, this is off, or whatever, whereas what I'm talking about is a spectrum, if you like. So it's more like, it's not like a switch that's on and off for one or the other, it's more like a slider in which, you know, one hemisphere can be more attended to, or it can be more in use in our attention to the world than the other. And I think that what has happened is that it's not so much that our brains are any different. I mean, of course, they're always different and evolving slowly over time as everything evolves. So it is true that our brains are probably subtly different from those of Achaean Greeks, you know, but if you put them into a scanner, which if you did the thought experiment and put them into a scanner, you wouldn't expect to see their brains very different from ours. So it's not that the brain itself is the key here, it's how the brain is being used. I think the way to think of it is rather like if you bought a new radio and you listen to a couple of stations that are your favorites, and after a while you begin to listen only to one. I think that's more the way it is. And I should emphasize that I don't think that the great changes in cultural history that I map out in the second half of the Master's Emissary, in which I look at the West from the time of the ancient Greeks through to the present day. I look at the sort of great changes and moments of change in the history of ideas, and in the rise and falls of the Greek, the Roman, and if you like, the modern civilization. And I'm not saying that the brain causes these changes, but what I'm saying that the causes of changes may be many, many things. They may be economic, they may be environmental changes, they may be wars, they may be political upheavals, they may be many things that cause people to change the way in which they live or think. But inevitably their thinking is, if you like, molded by the brain through which it is brought to be articulated. So it's perfectly coherent to talk of a period during which you can say that most of the phenomena of that culture appear to be expressive of a more left hemisphere dominated take on the world, or a more right hemisphere take. And that's really all that I'm saying when I'm talking about those things. And I do, to come back to your earlier point, I do definitely think that at the moment it's quite extraordinary how much this left hemisphere take dominates, and that we are not any longer apparently aware of all the richness, the beauty, the complexity, the meaning that the right hemisphere gives to life. So we think that we live in a world which is constituted by random lumps of senseless matter bumping into one another, and none of it has any purpose, meaning, or direction, or any beauty for that matter. So I'd strongly differ from that point of view.
It's also, you've said that the hemispheres are not two different ways of thinking about the world. They're different ways of being in the world. It's like no one is more
Absolutely.
legitimate than the other. They're not sort of competing hypotheses or something. They're just both ways of approaching the world. And so when somebody says, well, when I observe the material world and I see atoms and I see them bumping into each other and I don't observe anything else, are they making a mistake there? The way you just described it, sort of parodying this person who says, there's nothing. I mean, earlier you were talking about somebody who doesn't have meaning or love because all they see is sort of materialism, and I guess there's a sense in which I agree with you. I saw someone put it like, do you kiss your mother with that worldview? Like, do you really sort of believe that? Do you live like that? Maybe not, but are they like making a mistake?
Well, I think a very simple point, which can be made in a sentence, is: do you think love is real? If you do think love is real, then you have to accept that something that we don't know where it is, we don't know what it is, we can't measure it in the lab, we can't manipulate it in the lab, we can't see it or photograph it, we don't have a dial or a meter which will respond to it. We can find, but this is a very erroneous way of thinking, you can find a kind of different, you can find something that you presume is a proxy for love. But mistaking things for the proxies that can be measured is a fundamental, a very basic error of thinking. But as you say, the difference between the hemispheres is not just in ways of thinking, it's in ways of being, which includes thinking and feeling and behaving and a way of approaching the world, a way of attending to it, a way of being in it. In other words, it affects every aspect of your life. It doesn't just stop with an articulation of a few paragraphs of rather simple propositions. It's a whole way of being, and a civilization can adopt a way of being and a way of thinking which it's hardly aware of as peculiar, because it's forgotten the alternatives. Okay. And that this can be very destructive. And I believe that's the world we live in now, where I think a lot of people are simply no longer aware of what the world can offer, because we've disengaged ourselves from all the ways in which we used to be made aware of it. I mean, number one, living in close proximity to the natural world, which until very recently almost everybody in the world did. Living in a culture which has evolved over time and has evolved in such a way as to help stabilize that culture so that it can live in harmony with its environment, so that it can understand its experiences, worship of a divine or sacred realm. These are all the ways in which we can be reminded of things that are bigger and more complex than we are. And we've lost a sense of wonder before the world. We've lost a sense of modesty about what it is we can know. In other words, we've become arrogant and simplistic in our thinking. And the result of this has been known since time immemorial. It's what Greek tragedy was about, the hubris of the hero, somebody who had the potential to be great, but because he overreached himself and didn't know what it was he didn't know, he brought everything down on his head. And that is what we are now living out, I'm afraid. We're destroying society, we're destroying the planet, and we're destroying ourselves.
I want to talk about how we might go about fixing that shortly, but first I do want to, I suppose, push back on this idea. I mean, you said that the position can be summed up in a single question: do you believe in love? And I think a lot of my listeners will say it sort of depends on what you mean, because
Sure.
I experience this thing, love, you know, at least sometimes, and a lot of people are satisfied to say that this is an emergent property of atoms bumping into each other, and it's an interesting one and a fascinating one, and one that we still have a lot to learn about, but can essentially be understood by reducing it to its material parts. That is a very left brain way of thinking about what love is. And a lot of people are simply satisfied to say, well, that's what love is. It's a bit cynical, it's maybe a bit depressing, it's maybe not sort of how you
It's not.
behave, but then people are constantly exercising self-delusion all the time, and that this is what love is. I mean, what would you say to somebody who says that?
I say a lot of things. I mean, first and most trivially, of course, people believe that if they're being cynical, they're being more intelligent. Unfortunately, all the psychological research shows that people who are cynical are less intelligent than people whose yes, I quote it in The Matter with Things. The Matter with Things took my thinking very, very much further than what is in The Master and His Emissary into these realms particularly. But I just say that trivially, just don't pride yourself on being cynical. But I'd say it's simple-minded because, you know, it's promissory materialism. We can't tell you how the feeling you have for your partner, your loved one, emerges from colliding atoms. But we're just going to say so because we're going to stick to our dogma. That's stupid. That's the kind of thing that people who have no flexibility, no imagination do. They can say, oh, it's all going to be atoms bumping into one. How do they know that? Where did they derive that? Is that really science? Let's go to physics. Let's go to the physics of atoms. We now know that atoms are nothing like little billiard balls bumping into one another that we thought we were. We now know that the basis of matter is interchangeable with energy, first of all. The matter is interchangeable with energy, if that's what E equals mc squared means. And what exists, and we call the basis of matter, is probabilistic form fields. And those things that we used to call particles have no existence in the sense of like little tiny balls. You know, straight out of school, you might go around thinking. So forget all that. Spend a little time acquainting yourself with what physicists actually say. So physicists are much more, in my experience, philosophically sophisticated than biologists. Biologists have been subjected to a really thoroughly uninteresting, unethical, intellectually barren way of thinking, which physics jettisoned over 100 years ago. And I'm very relieved to say that biologists are beginning to realize they've got to jettison it as well. So just in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been enormous steps forward in biology, in which we now realize that organisms, living things, are nothing like machines, and that the machine model is an extraordinarily dangerous model to apply. It can help you solve small problems in a complex system. I don't know how much to go into this, but the
Well, tell me how
different
humans are not like computers. Yeah, I want to get into it. I think it's interesting. What do you mean when you say the idea that humans are like machines or computers is totally wrong?
Well, first of all, you can switch a computer off and come back 10 years later and switch it on. It'll probably work. You can't do that with a living organism. I mean, it's a simple point. It's an important one.
Yeah.
Machines can't themselves, in the process of making themselves, write the instructions that are the instructions to make themselves. A machine can be made by another machine if the instructions are put into that machine, the first machine. It can make a second machine. But there is no machine that in its coming into being, it is capable of planning its own existence. I mean, I know that in the genome that was going to be the blueprint, there's almost no information. I mean, it's so vanishingly small, it can't conceivably give the information of even quite simple things. We look at a nematode worm. You can cut its head off, and it will regrow a new head, and in that head it will have the memories that the old head had. Where do those memories come from? Yes, I mean, I don't know where to go. There's just so many things to say here.
Say them
the
all.
human brain in utero develops on average 4,000 new neurons every second. 4,000 new neurons every second. And when you look at the brain and you realize how complexly it is constructed, how important it is that different neurons are in the areas they are, where is the map for that? It's certainly not in the genome. You know, a machine can't love. A machine can't feel awe. A machine can't feel emotions. A machine hasn't got a body. A machine can't know it's going to die. It can't project a delighted future. It has no memory. It has data banks, but it doesn't have memory, which implies a consciousness. A machine is completely different from an organism. And what is really essential to this, but will sound rather